let's move into the Western history of psychedelics then, which is much more recent. And this is part of, I think, why it's so important to acknowledge and become familiar with the indigenous use of psychoactive plants and fungi, because the Western use and the Western popularization of these substances is very recent, and there have been and continue to be issues of cultural appropriation, stealing, use of and exploitation of peoples that use these substances in their communities, indigenous peoples, as well as the plants themselves, which have been harvested and sold for profit. There's a big psychedelic tourism industry now, especially in Central and South America. And many of these plant species are at risk because of this westernized appropriation and commodification of these substances. So really important to name that as we now delve into more of the Western history of psychedelics. So as I mentioned, a first wave of psychedelic research in the West happened in the 1950s to about the mid-1980s, with a second wave happening starting in around 2000 to the present. So that first wave, there were hundreds and hundreds of studies published on various substances, including LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, MDA, to name others. And one of the issues at the time was these studies were flawed. There was often not a control group. There is historical record of very unethical practices with powerful psychoactive substances like LSD in research settings. And so there was a bit of an upheaval at the time, which also paralleled some political agendas. And there was a criminalization of these substances, and they eventually became taken away from the realm of substances that can be looked at in research. And this coincided with the war on drugs, which was initiated by the Nixon administration and later continued by the Reagan administration in the United States of America and followed around the world. So during the first wave of psychedelic research, psychoanalysis was really the mainstay of treatment in psychiatry. So this was really before the big wave of biological psychiatry that came after the discovery of serotonin and the development of drugs like serotonin reuptake inhibitors, common antidepressants working on serotonin and other neurotransmitters. So many of the research studies that were done in this first wave from the 50s to the mid-80s were actually looking at these substances as more of an adjunct to a psychotherapeutic process, and not from the lens of, could this be a substance to take every day to treat a symptom of a psychiatric illness as defined by the DSM, for example, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which was later formed to outline and classify and categorize mental health disorders. So what's interesting, what I find interesting is nowadays, the resurgence of research from the 2000s to present in the second wave, which has been also known as the Renaissance of psychedelic research in the West, is coming back to this model of using a psychoactive psychedelic substance as an adjunct to a psychotherapeutic process, not as just a drug in and of itself to treat a condition. So in the roughly 40 years that was this gap between the first and second wave of Western psychedelic research, there was the rise of biological psychiatry. And then this second wave, there's this kind of return to a different model where psychedelic substances are looked at in the context of a healing process that includes a really carefully crafted therapeutic environment encompassing psychotherapy. So we'll talk a little bit about that more. But more on the history of Western psychedelics. A lot of people don't know that the entactogen MDMA was actually first synthesized in 1912 by the pharmaceutical company Merck. And at the time, they didn't know what its properties were, what it could be potentially used for. It was essentially a molecule that was put on the shelf at that time. And only later was MDMA resynthesized by Alexander Shulgin, a Swiss chemist living in the United States. And Alex Shulgin was known for using the molecules that he synthesized on himself, has written many books about his personal experiences and that of his wife, and Shulgin, using substances on themselves and learning about their subjective effects personally. And it was through this that the profound and pathogenic effects of MDMA became known. And this molecule was distributed to therapists with the question, might this be useful for psychotherapy? People who were first users of MDMA after its resynthesis became familiar with powerful empathy-enhancing effects, trust-enhancing effects, and it actually became fairly widely used in psychotherapy by psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, before it was eventually scheduled in the mid-'80s to join the ranks of LSD and psilocybin, which were scheduled earlier. Interest in the value of psychedelic medicines like MDMA really began in the 1920s in psychiatry. While most of the published research started to come out in the 50s, as I mentioned, and LSD was first synthesized in 1938 by Albert Hofmann. And it wasn't until later that Albert Hofmann actually discovered himself the properties of LSD through an accidental ingestion of a large dose of LSD, and its powerful psychedelic properties then became known. So an interesting point of a similar history to MDMA. So we saw this surge of research followed by the Controlled Substances Act, and then this break between the first and second wave.
This mini lecture is part of Nuances' Introduction to Psychedelics, which is a free course where we explore the world of psychedelic medicines and their potential as therapeutic tools. Check out the link in the description for more info.